good evening, everybody, or anybody who's awake. I had me a nice long sleep today. I slept the entire day away. Um, I was going to do this to discuss the continuing issue in Eastern Europe, also the situation now developing in Syria, and also a little bit about the disparity in the air defense artillery numbers, uh, especially between China and the USA. Also, I was going to discuss the African situation with the Chinese and Russian influences there, as well as the Chinese and Russians. And because I was going to address a question somebody asked me about that in my last live stream. I think it was TJ who asked me about the if the Chinese and the Russian troops got the same thing in the arm that ours did. So I'm going to start off by saying the situation in the proxy conflict is, of course, drawing to a close. Now we have the situation in Bakhmut almost being resolved with a victory for the invasion side. I hate that I have to self censor, otherwise, my videos will never get kicked out by the algos, but I have to describe things in certain ways, of course. Um, so you have the situation in the East basically developing into the pinning action that it actually is developing into for the future main invasion by the 540,000 or so odd troops that are sitting in Belarus and also in Belgorod in Russia. So you have this situation nearing its conclusion. You even have the head general of the proxy forces admitting such, as I've mentioned in my last live stream about that. Now, he has conceded to the fact that he is losing and that they need more weaponry and fast just to even be able to stabilize the situation. Now, he had asked for about 300 more additional main battle tanks and 800 additional armor personnel carriers just to even be able to stabilize the situation. Because out of the 190,000 remaining troops that the proxy army has at its disposal, only 2 brigades out of that entire force are in any sort of condition to even be able to wage any type of offensive. So that is very, very limited because a brigade is not very big in terms of overall size. So the situation, I feel, over there is drawing to a conclusion and fast because the whole thing over there reeks of desperation insofar as, the limited options now available to that Eastern European nation in order to be able to ward off this massive invasion that's coming. They've also asked for Patriot missiles, and, the West is doing a counter buildup, of course, as I've mentioned before a few times, with about 30,000 NATO forces backed up by nearly 1,000 tanks. Now, again, we know the disparity between artillery is severe. Now, when I've discussed this in the past, I've mentioned that the artillery having been given away in terms of the sheer amounts of ammunition for the artillery, be it the 270 millimeter rockets, also the howitzer artillery shells, which both are not easily replaceable. Here's an example: the 270 millimeter rocket artillery, it takes them 1 whole year just to be able to produce 250 of those. So these weapons, we've given away about half of our entire stockpile of 270 millimeter rocket artillery ammunition, which means that it would literally take several decades just to be able to replace those numbers alone. Now, the artillery shells, many, many, many more of those have been given as well, both the 105 millimeter and the 155 millimeter. Now, those also are not easily replaceable. So you have that situation developing to where it's coming to a conclusion and pretty quick. The proxy forces have not been able to compete in any sort of way with the amounts of artillery required to even be able to wage any type of successful offensives. And we know also that they have a tendency to use their artillery on civilian targets, like in the east there. They have been shelling cities, civilian targets in the LPR and DPR, instead of using that against military targets, which is taking away from any potential possible successes, I'll say, on the battlefield. Because artillery, you cannot wage a good war without field artillery, because it's integrated in combined arms warfare. You have artillery, you have your armored forces, and you have, your infantry, your mechanized infantry formations. And to be able to wage any type of successful ground campaign, you need to fight it in an integrated manner, especially when you're conducting any type of real sorts of offensives. Now, for them to admit that they're down to only 2 brigades, which would be effective in any sort of conflict there, like for any sort of offensive, that would be a very, very limited sort of offensive, because again, we're talking in like Ukraine sizes, anywhere between 3,000 and 7,000 troops to formulate a brigade, probably closer to the 5,000 to 6,000 range. And we know that they've been severely depleted of forces. They just don't have it. So 190,000 troops, for the vast majority of them to not be adequately equipped in order that they can wage any type of offensive. They're basically like static defense type of forces. They're immobile. They can't travel. They can't conduct offensives. They're pretty much stuck in trench systems. Now, they can't be rapidly deployed either. So that means that while they're so laser focused on the east, as I always use that term, that is a grand pinning action by which the Russian forces in Belarus and also in the Belgorod region of Russia can come sweeping down and basically annihilate whatever remains of the Ukrainians. And there's nothing the West can do about it other than to continue to send in mercs with these different PMCs. And most of them are Western forces that either their contracts and their militaries ran out, especially in the Eastern European NATO nations like Poland and Slovakia and Romania, and so on and so forth. I mean, I even heard there were Germans there too. Once their contracts, their enlistments are up, they join these PMCs and they go and volunteer to fight over there in the proxy country. And they're getting annihilated by the thousands now. So all that NATO as an organization, officially has been able to do is do a counter buildup. Now, their counter buildup is quite small overall in comparison to what the Russians have built up. The Russians have a full complement of over 1,500 additional tanks. They have over 3,500 additional artillery pieces. Now, this is part of the big, massive invasion forces that they've been putting together. Now, they also have, How many armored personnel carriers? Hold on. They have well in excess of, 1,800 armored personnel carriers. That's insane. That's just the extra invasion forces that are being put together in Belarus and the Belgorod region of Russia for their big sweep. And I see them doing a big sweep. I don't see them putting together forces like that just not to use them. I mean, that would be insane. It would make no sense. It costs a lot of money to deploy forces. It costs a lot of resources too, because even if you're just invading your neighbor, say you're a country and you're just invading your neighbor, the logistical feats that you have to go to be able to do that, the money that has to be spent to shuffle around your forces, the logistics, everything, the transportation, civilization, it costs an immense amount of resources and time and money. You're not going to go through all of that just to not use it. That would be totally senseless, you know. And the Russians, they don't bluff. They don't bluff. So again, you have a massive disparity now between the West and Russia. And that disparity is even bigger when you look at a country like China versus the West. You know, it's, hey, Rebecca, great to see you. Good to see you. Yeah, you have an even bigger disparity when you look at China in the West, because China is even bigger than Russia. They are the world superpower, hegemon in real terms, very real terms. You know, we're talking about a country that is the biggest steel producing nation, biggest zinc producing nation, and biggest tungsten producing nation, biggest titanium producing nation, biggest chemical producing nation, so on and so forth. They have the biggest military industrial complex on the face of the earth, too. They already have the most ground vehicles in terms of armored fighting vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, and APCs, armored personnel carriers, and also their main battle tank fleet is the biggest in the world. And I'm going by active and storage numbers, and the storage numbers are the numbers that equip their massive reserve forces and their paramilitary. They have the biggest artillery arm in the world, too. China does, alongside of Russia, of course. They're basically, for all intents and purposes, they're basically tied in the number of artillery they have. And if that's active and storage. So also helicopters. Russia has a little bit more aviation assets than China, but China is building theirs phenomenally fast now that they've had this massive industrial capacity for at least the past 5 years or so. So they're catching up. And I was going to discuss air defense artillery and the massive disparity there between China and the USA, because China has the biggest air defense arm on the face of the earth, too. And, you know, they're just massive. They're massive. And they have the biggest ground-based missile forces as well. Their strategic rocket forces have thousands upon thousands of not only ballistic but also cruise missiles that they can call upon in a conflict. Some of them are hypersonics, and others are supersonic, meaning they break the sound barrier in terms of cruise missiles. You know, they're not subsonic cruise missiles like the Tomahawk, but they also have anti-ship missiles. They have all kinds of missiles. China is just a very missile-heavy nation. Russia is too, but they're second after China in overall missile numbers. So China is this monster, this behemoth, just sitting over there, not even doing anything just yet. But when they do, it'll make a severe impact. We know they have the biggest, most technologically advanced Navy. They've come a long way in the past 30 years. Their electronic warfare capabilities are phenomenal, just like the Russians are. You know, the Russians have Kibini, they have Kirkutsk, they have Murmansk systems. You know, the Chinese have the KG-600, and they have other systems. You know, they've already been tried and true. You know, there were 2 F-35s that strayed within range of Mumian Island and the electronic warfare assets based at Mumian Island. And instantly, these 2 F-35s nearly crashed. They nearly crashed into the sea because they couldn't control their aircraft. You know, they just barely made it out of the field that was generated by the Chinese electronic warfare assets. Now, we also know what happened to the Donald Cook in the Black Sea, not once but twice. Once in 2014 and again in 2021, where they got shut off like a light switch. And that's supposed to be our most advanced type of battleship we have in terms of the electronics on board, the radar suites, the missile systems, so on and so forth. That's supposed to be our most advanced ship, an Aegis-class ship, and it got shut off like a light switch. So, you know, Russia is playing games right now. They're not even trying. But if the West gets drawn into a conflict, you can bet your ass that the Russians are going to go all the way. They're going to use everything they have, all their electronic warfare. They're going to turn all of that stuff on. See, putting Patriot missile systems on the borders of the Proxy and with Poland, that would do nothing, because if the Russians have these electronic warfare assets and they turn them on, those missile batteries are useless. They will be useless. in terms of air defense capabilities. So that is that as it relates to the proxy conflict. Now, also, you have the situation developing in the Middle East there, in Syria, whereby you've had Turkey and Assad of Syria, Bashar al-Assad and his regime, and you have the Turks and you have the Russians holding talks. Now, they're coming to an understanding whereby there's deals being cut. Turkey is going to extricate itself from the whole issue. So the small area within Syria where there are U.S. forces based, they're trying to fortify those forces to sit there to help the Kurds, but the Kurds may have to enter into a deal themselves because those U.S. forces have to be resupplied, and the Iraqis and Jordanians are not very keen on continuing to support this issue, especially since Russia, even China, and other major powers are involved, and Turkey is beginning to side with the Russians. Now, remember, over a year ago, I told everybody, I said, the Turks, if NATO falls apart, the Turks and the Canadians are going to be the first to go. Canada, because it's extremely close and tied in with China on almost every level. The Chinese have their leadership, their regime in Canada beneath their thumb. So, on every level, you're going to have, the NATO alliance begin to fall apart, especially after a failure in this proxy conflict. So Turkey seems like it'll be the first to go because they've been aligning themselves very closely with not only Russia, but the whole Eurasian bloc, and being a Belt and Road signatory as well with the Chinese. So the conditions are changing. They're changing rapidly. The conditions in the Middle East, the conditions around the world are changing drastically. Even in Africa, where you've had this, Pan-African summit held here in our country, which is going to be an overall failure because the Chinese and the Russians already got there before us. Now there's a scramble on there's a second scramble for Africa, and it looks to be a sort of futile, by the way. It looks to be a sort of futile attempt at neo-colonialism. But it's too late because the Russians and Chinese must have offered them something better, because now you have the Russians in the country of Mali. You also have them building a naval installation in Sudan, at Port Sudan. You also, in the Red Sea, you also have them in the Central African Republic. They've formed close bonds with that regime there, and they train their military forces. You have the Chinese all throughout sub-Saharan Africa, which is Africa beneath the Sahara, the southern parts of Africa. Chinese Belt and Road has taken firm hold in many of those nations. So their influence they wield, their economic, military, and political influence cannot be denied. It can't. So this is something, this summit they held, which I see going absolutely nowhere at all. Because the situations the realities on the ground are changing, and they're changing drastically. We have this Eurasian bloc rising, this Eastern bloc. They're developing their own Eastern currency, which I see as being the one world currency, because the 10 kings of Revelation are going to be Eastern Eurasian kings. There will be no West. There will be no Western anything. There won't be a Western NWO or anything, because the West, we know, gets destroyed, and that's the last we hear of it in the Word is when they talk about Mystery Babylon, and it is defeated. It is occupied by massive armies. So you basically, well, welcome, Platinum Falcon. Great to see you. Everybody's welcome here. I'm glad that there's people coming in. I know this is kind of late. I had slept all day, but, I had a good sleep. I just got up a little while ago, just chilling. So I decided, since I usually do a live on Tuesday and I sort of missed that, I decided to, come on and do one now, so might as well, right? So anyways, you have these issues going on around the world. The realities on the ground are shifting. Now, you already have bin Salman of Saudi becoming very close with China, but also with Russia as well. And you see him beginning to start the process of undermining the petrodollar, because that goes all the way back to Bretton Woods, which Bretton Woods occurred in 1944 on Jekyll Island, and Bretton Woods is what established the petrodollar as the world reserve currency, but that is beginning to now be undermined by nations such as China and Russia, who, for their own reasons, have basically initiated their own dumping of treasuries, especially in China's case, and Russia, not out of choice, but because they had sanctions placed upon them. They were cut away from SWIFT, but it was okay for them because they already had FSPS, just like China has SIPs. And you see, people have always said that China was weakening when in fact they're not. They're strengthening in terms of their value of their currency. China is not broke, and they will never be broke, because China is also the world's single biggest gold holding nation at 6,400 plus tons of gold. Now, the value of gold is severely suppressed. So the real value of the gold that China holds is in the several trillions range. So even if they just partially back their currency with gold, they could never go broke. That's impossible. It's impossible. But they're going to benefit from a petro-yuan renminbi. They're going to get all the same benefits for their yuan that we had for our dollar. So China, is this economic, financial, military, and industrial superpower with 40% of the entire world's industrial base in just China. So nobody can compete with that. Realistically, nobody can compete with that. Just like how Russia is a resource superpower, nobody can compete with them either in terms of the commodities. So China and Russia have real commodities in the forms of different resources, but also in products. China produces massive amounts of different products. They have an extremely diverse economy, and they have extremely high technology, because they have grown by leaps and bounds through economic, financial, industrial, corporate, and other forms of espionage, even military espionage. They reorganized their entire military off of our model, because they've seen that combined arms is more effective than having these massive, unwieldy corps-size formations of these massive forces that basically they're not, they're hard to control. They're not integrated. You might have like a whole artillery corps, a whole tank corps, a whole infantry corps, but they're not integrated. Their ability to communicate and work together as a force was severely impacted and inhibited. So they broke those up and made combined arms divisions and brigades within their group armies. A group army is essentially 50 to 55,000 troops, and it's comprised of different regiments, brigades, even independent battalions in some cases, like spec ops battalions. I think nearly every single solitary Chinese group army has at least, at the very minimum, a spec ops battalion, but some even have spec ops brigades. They're integrated with special operations. They have their electronic warfare units. Some of them have aviation units, not all, because they don't have enough helos yet to go around. But there are plenty of group armies that do have aviation assets. They also artillery, armor, and mechanized infantry, all working in concert. And their cyber warfare program is the most advanced in the world by far. They pour the most money into it than any other nation. I mean, their cyber capabilities are phenomenal. They're over the top. So they have a lot of options. And, I was going to discuss the disparity between USA and Chinese air defense artillery, because I was going to go over the numbers of the air defense assets that these nations have. Now, the primary form of air defense employed by the USA is the 1,200 Patriot missile systems that are broken up into 16 battalions and 50 batteries within those 16 battalions. Now, that means that your typical battalion would have at least 3 batteries each. Now, there would be 2 left over that would have 4 batteries if you do the math, but most of them are 3 batteries, and and in each battery you have roughly six Patriot missile systems, and of course the radars. Now, the other thing that applies in terms of the air defense is the THAAD system, which is the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System. Now, there's some 42 of those organized into 7 batteries. So, all in all, that makes about 1,242 air defense systems when it comes to like medium to long range and extremely long range combined. Now, 1,242, versus China's. Let's see. China, when it comes to the intermediate to long range, they have 1,756 different systems. Now, China has a myriad of different systems, so they don't have it's not as limited or standardized as the Americans are, but they have different systems to form one of the most cohesive and integrated forms of air defense in the world, because not only do they have about 500 HQ-2Js, which are an extremely modified form of the original HQ-2, they also have 120 HQ-7Ps. They have, of the HQ-6D, they have 30. Of the HQ-12, they have 32. The HQ-16AE, they have, 200. Of the HQ-22, they have 180. Now, that's a newer one. And they have the HQ-9A and B. And out of that, they have about 130 of those. They have the HQ-19, they have 60. They have the FK-2000, which is the anti-satellite, anti-stealth bomber, anti-ballistic missile system. They have about 100 of those. They have it's like an intermediate, shorter range system that's made to down drones, helos, and low-flying aircraft and missiles. They have the FK-3000. They have 60 of those. Then they also even bought Russian systems just to add to their own. They bought Russian systems like the modified S-300s, which they have 160 of which. They even bought the S-400, which is one of Russia's premier systems, and they have 36 of those. They have the HQ-12, which is a Chinese system, and that they have about 24 of. So when you combine all those numbers, you get 1,756 total. And for their shorter range systems, now this is like their point defense for their units. Now they have the Type 90, which is, let me see, cat chewed on this. Let's see, they got 1,000 Type 90s, which are air defense cannons. They have which are like 57 millimeter, humongous air defense cannons. They have 500 Type 95 SP AAAs, which are vehicles that combine a 25 millimeter Gatling gun, which is pretty big, with FB-10 missiles, about 4 apiece on a vehicle chassis. Now they have 500 Type 62Es. They have 1,500 FK-3000s. Or I'm sorry. No, wait, my bad. I read that wrong. No, they got 80 LD-2000s. And they have other systems which comprise another 150 additional systems. I read that wrong. That was kind of mixed in with my other list of the more intermediate to longer range stuff. Now they have 2,230 short to medium range systems. And like I read earlier, they have 1,756 intermediate to longer range systems. Now, when you combine that, you get a grand total of 3,886 different systems. That is enormous. So they have integrated air defense from short range to medium, intermediate to long range. So they have options, and it's all integrated. So they can hit everything, basically. They can take down missiles. They can take down, in some cases, projectiles, like if it's certain types of artillery. They can take down helicopters, low-flying attack aircraft, high-flying attack aircraft, fighter jets, strategic heavy bombers, stealth bombers, all the way up to satellites and ballistic missiles. So they have this enormous integrated air defense arm, whereas we have a much smaller one, much smaller, at 1,242. And it comprises really only two systems. Now, of course, we have shorter range systems like the man-portable air defense, like the Stingers. But as I've read in the last live stream, we have given immense amounts of those away. So I'm not even sure how much of those we even have left. And I'm talking about the short-range systems like the Stingers. Now, we also have a very small amount of the Centurion systems, which are 20 millimeter Gatling guns that, they're on a radar. In fact, in my civil conflict docuseries, the Mormon state used one of those because, remember, they have a lot of access to different munitions and systems because their territory held an installation, I think it was Thule or something, which had tested and either decommissioned or tested or stored away immense amounts of different munitions and systems. So they had access to stuff like that. Now, we have a really limited number of those types of things, but, it's not really enough to make any sort of real difference. But, they have immense options when it comes to air defense artillery. They have these massive air defense artillery arms, with different types of systems. I would say the Russians have definitely the second biggest after China. And what's funny is China even bought some of their systems just to add to what they already had, which is crazy. So they have these humongous options. Now, we know the S-400 is fairly close in capabilities to the Chinese HQ-9B. They're both basically in the same weight class. Like they say in boxing, they're both in basically the same weight class, as they both, are very long-range systems. They can fire very high. They both have outstanding tracking radars. The missiles themselves is the only difference. Now, the S-400 that the Russians have is just a little bit better. It has a little bit more of a range than the HQ-9, but the HQ-9 is definitely still punching in that weight class. So China not only has their HQ-9Bs, but they also have, their S-400s that they bought from Russia, and they also have their anti-satellite, anti-ballistic missile, anti-stealth bomber air defense system, which was actually made from the HQ-9B, called the FK-2000. So they have enormous capabilities. And the other thing I was going to talk about was, before I forget, I have a horrible memory issue. I was going to discuss some of the questions that were asked in the last live stream about, the Chinese and Russian forces, and if they got the same thing that our troops did in terms of the thing in the arm. And to that, I'm going to say no, actually not. What the Russians and Chinese got, even though it's not a good thing, it was much more akin to like a regular one for the FLU that most people get every month. Now, it was more akin to that. Now, as far as the Chinese one, now they might have done something as far as tampering with M to the R to the N to the A, but I'm not so sure about that. I'm not really sure. I've just heard that. But they didn't put all this extra stuff in that's extremely deadly and devastating. I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying that, they're not out to eliminate their own armed forces like what's happened here. So there's a lot of differences. Also, they have different plans. As I've talked about many times, the Chinese and the Russians, the Russians would like certain lands back because they want to basically turn the Arctic into a Russian lake, and they want some additional lands from Canada. They want the 3 northern territories. They want Nunavut, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories, so they can make the entire Arctic a Russian lake. I'm sure they want Greenland as well. All the resources up there are immense, and it's enough to make any nation potentially the wealthiest nation in the world due to the amounts of mineral resources, fuel resources, and even the timber that's up there, among others. So China would like the lower 48 and, of course, lower Canada, which they basically already have under their thumb because they basically have that regime under their thumbs. So China has wanted to colonize America for a long time, as even disclosed by Wei Fang and the previous two defense ministers who have all made those speeches to the Politburo. Now, you used to be able to find those speeches easily, but now it's getting harder and harder. It's like they're trying to censor that. You know, if I didn't have such a POS phone, I would have copied and pasted it somewhere, but I don't have the memory for it, unfortunately. This thing really is a POS. I really hate it. I mean, it's garbage, but, you know, hey, it's been with me for a while, so, you know, it's still chugging along. But basically, that's mostly what I had to say, really, unless anybody in the chat has any sort of thing they want to add or comment or question, whatever, you know. But see what's going on here. See, we got 10 people in here. How's everybody doing? Hope everybody's all right. Platinum Falcon, I'm glad you're here. Good to see you. You're welcome here. Rebecca. Yeah, Platinum Falcon. That, yeah, they're. I heard that too. You know, I can't verify it, but I heard it, and I tend to believe that could happen. That they could make that a regular sort of deal with all those different types of juices. I'll just call it. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I appreciate everybody here. Hey, C-Mac, great to see you. Hope you're well. Hope everybody's doing all right tonight. You know, anyone else want to chime in? Feel free. You know, I'm a gentleman. I'm always willing to listen. Let's see. Yeah, Platinum Falcon. I agree. I agree with you. I think they probably would. And no warning at all, because, you know, when you read not only like Revelation, where it talks about a certain city, not the nation of Babylon, but the city of Babylon, which we all know is its main commercial center, and it's in the northeast, you know, it gets destroyed in 1 hour. Well, you know, the nation of Babylon is what gets discussed in Jeremiah 50 and 51, and it doesn't quite get destroyed in an hour, but it gets overrun really quickly because of the descriptions that it gives. I've read Jeremiah 50 and 51 to people before. You know, I mean, it's all in there. I mean, it describes how fast that this place will be overrun. That the leader of it, the king, they say in the word in Jeremiah 50:51, they say that the king will be constantly getting reports of different areas falling to the invaders. So even in my audio book of the invasion, my hypothetical, I included that. So, you know, that was something I even put, I think it was like 2 parts ago, I mentioned that type of thing actually occurring. So, yeah, I definitely agree that with that. Oh, I see you, Rebecca. Yeah, what's that, C-Mac? About the B-2 planes? Well, I guess they've been recalled or something like that. I didn't hear the whole story. I've been sleeping all day, but, you know, I'm sure they got recalled because the Russians have the S-400 and S-600, which are both, I'm sorry, S-500, and I'm sure they do have an S-600, but I know for sure they have an S-400 and the S-500, and the S-500 is their anti-ballistic missile, anti-satellite, and anti-stealth aircraft air defense weapon. I mean, just like how the Chinese have the HQ-9B, you know, they had the A and now they have the B. The B is designed, to knock down very high-flying aircraft, including stealth aircraft. But the FK-2000 that they have is designed to do that as well. That's their anti-satellite weapon, anti-ballistic missile, and anti-stealth bomber aircraft, basically. And, of course, we know China has their own stealth bomber. They have the Ch-1a, which, for now, the numbers of how many have been produced is a state secret. They already did their test flights 2 years ago. And the funny thing is a lot of the information you look for on it, like if you're just looking through some of these search engines, they're giving old information about it. They don't know, what has transpired since that point in time whereby they were doing just the test flights. This thing's been put into serial production by now and mass deployment. So they originally had a bomber force of heavy strategic aircraft. They had 242 H-6Ks, which also they have the H-6Gs and other modifications done on some of the other ones. But they had 242 of these aircraft. Now, these are extremely large strategic aircraft, sort of similar to our B-52, but it's a lot more upgraded. It's gone through a series of different upgrades to where it's got electronic warfare systems fitted into it now to suppress enemy radars and electronic systems. I mean, they've got the KG-600 on it, basically. They also equipped most of the flying leopards, the JH-7s. It's called the Flying Leopard. They equipped most of their ground attack planes, which are the JH-7s. They've equipped most of those with the electronic warfare pods as well, the KG-600 systems. They've also equipped their J-16D, which is specifically designed. It's a version of the J-16 fighter aircraft, which has been reclassed in the D variant as an electronic attack aircraft. So it's designed from a fighter into a fighter bomber where they can use electronic warfare to suppress air defense systems so that they can go in there and fire anti-radiation missiles, which are like your air-to-ground missiles that target radar sites and all those types of things. So they have equipped some of their most devastating aircraft with these electronic warfare systems. So, China and Russia aren't playing games, and if the U.S. did deploy the B-2s, then, that could provoke Russia in such a way to where, you don't know what they might do. They might unleash their electronic warfare systems on NATO. I mean, nobody knows. They might do that as like a warning to NATO, like a sort of shot across the bow, like, hey, don't F around with us, like that type of deal. Nobody really knows, but if they did do that, I don't think it's a very wise move because Russia has everything they need to shoot down our stealth aircraft. But they're not in any way a threat to Russia. They're in no way a threat to Russia or China for that matter, especially not China. China has like thousands of air defense systems. I just read off by number and name. China's enormous. They're not to be messed with. Neither is Russia. But see, anybody else have anything they want to say? Feel free to chime in. I gotta push these buttons to see the chat. I can't see the chat. Hides it from me. Yeah, I mean, you're right, Platinum Falcon. I agree. That could be an issue, definitely. I mean, they could do a lot of damage with that. The IRGC of Iran, they're a big proponent of hands-on type of warfare as far as it deals with attacking the enemy's grid. So, like, if we got into a war with Iran, their IRGC has mentioned, which is like a state of intent, they've mentioned that they know where all our substations are, which is like a veiled type of a threat that in a state of war that they would go after those on the ground, which the IRGC, they're more hands-on, whereas like Russia and China don't even have to do that. They have their cyber warfare programs are so beefed up And because our grid's connected to the net, anything connected to the net can be hacked. So our grid's connected to the net. And China and Russia don't even have to do anything hands-on. They can just shut it all down with a nasty cyber virus or whatever, whatever else they want to use. It could be some type of ware, like a form of like ransomware, but it's just way over the top and way, worse. Who knows what they have, but China's not to be messed with. We're talking about a country that has, the most combat aircraft. They're all 4.5 or 5th generation aircraft, extremely advanced, extremely massive combat air fleet. Russia for their part, if you include all their strategic bombers that are kept in storage, they also have quite a massive fleet of aircraft. They have the biggest actual strategic bomber fleet, but they don't have the numbers of ground attack or fighter aircraft that say China has. China just has more than anybody, and when it comes to fighter aircraft or ground attack aircraft, but they have the second biggest strategic bomber fleet, and I'm talking about China. Now, when you combine all three categories, ground attack, fighter, and strategic bombers, China has the most aircraft in the world when it comes to combat aircraft. Now, Russia would be number 2, and then we would be number 3. And the reason why Russia is number 2 is because after the Cold War ended, they didn't just throw their bomber aircraft away. They kept them in storage, and they basically, maintained them, upgraded them. They have a significant air reserve fleet of heavy strategic aircraft, and also helicopters too. They didn't get rid of all those Hinds, those Hind air attack and transport aircraft. That's a unique type of attack helicopter because the Hind not only can carry about a squad of troops, but it's also an air mobile firing platform. It can destroy everything from tanks to infantry targets to whatever else. I mean, it is a form of an attack aircraft, but at the same time, it's also a form of a utility helicopter. It's like both combined into one. They didn't. Their Air Force operates their helicopters. The Russian VVS, which is their Air Force, they operate their helicopter fleet. It's not their army. In some countries, it's the Army. Most countries, I should say, it's the Army that operate rotary aircraft. But in this case, the Russian Air Force operates their rotary aircraft. So their helicopters that they had since the Cold War, they didn't scrap them. No, they put them up and they stored them away and they maintained them for their reserves. Same with their heavy strategic bomber aircraft. They didn't get rid of all that. That's like treasure. That's like gold. Why would you throw gold in the trash can? They didn't do that. It's well understood that they've kept that stuff. Now, the same with their tank fleet. Sure. I mean, they've got a lot of tanks in the boneyard. They got about 8,000 tanks in the boneyard. I mean, some of them work, some of them don't. Most of them don't, actually. I mean, because most of them are like the T-54/55 series of tanks, and those are just so old and rusted. They would need like a full refurb to be able to become operational again. But they also have T-62s in there, T-64s, and even some T-72s. Now, the T-72s and some of the T-64s might still work because the last of the T-64s was actually retired in 2015. They had like the T-64 M series. I think it was the M or the B. Those were the most upgraded, newest T-64 model, but they put them into long-term storage because they got better tanks to replace them with, like the T-80s, the upgraded T-72s, the T-90 tanks, and now they're building more and more of their newest tank, which is the T-14 Armata. They still don't have humongous numbers of the Armata yet, but they have a lot of T-90s, and the T-90s are pretty damn advanced. It's sort of like this. It's a similar concept, not quite the same, but it's a similar concept with China. China developed 2 brand new tanks, but they've mass-produced them to phenomenal amounts. Like China has in excess by now of 2,500 of the the T-99. I'm sorry, not T. The Type 99A tanks, and they've produced over 5,000 of the Type 96B tanks, which are the most upgraded iteration of the Type 96. They also have the A series of the Type 99As. So all in all, we're talking about like China's frontline tanks. They have over 7,500. And really, if you want to consider it, they've got about 9,000, because if you put the T80, 85, 88 series, because it's the T80, 88 series includes the T85. Sorry, not T, Type 85, type. I get that mixed up. Now, the Russians have T and the Chinese have types. So the Chinese Type 80, 85, 88 series, uh, basically, it's the same chassis, but with different turrets and gun configurations. Now, the Type 85 tank has a 125 millimeter gun, the latest iteration of the Type 85. Now, you have the Type 88 also having it's the Type 88C, which has a 125 millimeter gun. Now, the original Type 80 only had a 105 millimeter tank gun, just like they have that upgraded form of the L7. I believe it's the Type, what is it? The Type 83A, which is this upgraded form of the NATO L7 cannon, which is not only longer range because it's a longer gun, it's got higher velocity and a further range than the original NATO L7, but they also have the ability to fire anti-tank guided missiles from the bore of the tank, from the bore of the gun. So like they can actually do that. They've upgraded this gun to make it able to do that, making the tanks that operate this gun system extremely lethal on the modern battlefield. Even though they're older upgraded tanks, they still have the ability to kill brand spanking new main battle tanks, because an anti-tank guided missile coming crashing down on the roof of a tank, which is one of the lighter areas of a tank's defenses of its armor, is going to come crashing through there and destroy it. So yeah, they might have to get in a little closer if they're going to fire like sabot ammunition or basically depleted uranium shells. They might have to get into about 2,000 meters, like 2 kilometers. They might have to get in closer to be able to score like a lethal hit with those on the sides or the back. But if they're firing anti-tank guided missiles, and which tend to come crashing down into the roof of the tank, they're going to destroy that tank. So all their old tanks, like their the Type 59Ds, which are the most upgraded iteration of the Type 59, which are still extremely lethal tanks on the modern battlefield. They have some 8,000 of these Type 59 tanks, and 5,000 of those are the D series, and I think they still operate others that are the Type 59 2As or something like that. I can't remember where it is. I wrote it down somewhere, but they still operate these tanks, and they're extremely lethal, even today. But they've passed them down to third-rate units because they're first- and second-rate units. These newer, more modern tanks have been proliferating. So when you combine the numbers, you get... I'll read them all right now because I'm also going to read the light tanks. When you combine all the numbers of the tanks, you get a grand total of, 19,300 main battle tanks, and that's the main battle tanks. But if you add the light tanks, there's 3,800 light tanks, and all in all, combined, you get a grand tally of 23,100 tanks. That's everything. That's all the active units tanks and the storage units tanks. That's everything. We don't have anywhere near that many tanks. I mean, like we only have like a quarter of that many tanks, if that, because we know the Marine Corps put their Abrams into storage long term. So we've got, 6,000, 6,400 tanks left or something like that. It's not very many. Especially when we're comparing to Russia or China, which Russia's active tank fleet is 12,500 main battle tanks. That's pretty damn big. And then China's fleet is 23,100, and that's their main battle tanks and light tanks combined. So you got about 1,500 Type 62G light tanks. You got 1,300 Type 63s. You've got 1,000 Type 15s. Now, the Type 15 is their newest light tank. You got 1,000 of those. So you combine the light tank numbers, you get your 3,800 number, and then you combine the main battle tanks. You have 8,000 of the Type 59s. That's the D and the others. So you've got 8,000. You've got of the Type 88s. I'm sorry, the Type 69, 79s. You've got about 2,000 of them remaining, which that's like an even more upgraded version. For all intents and purposes, that's an even more upgraded version of the Type 59. It's basically just a Type 59 on steroids. Now you've got 2,000 of them. Then of the Type 80, 85, 88 series, you got 1,800 of those. Now 600 out of that 1,800 is the Type 85 series. The Type 80, I think it's the Type 85M series, which is the most upgraded iteration of that tank. Now, for the Type 96, you've got 5,000 of the Type 96Bs, and you've got 2,500 of the Type 99As. Now, that's the grand total, is where you get your 19,300 main battle tanks, and the light tanks is 3,800. Both combined is 23,100 grand total. So China's got this monstrous tank fleet. They also have, if you include the MRAPs and armored trucks they have alongside of their 39,000 something, infantry fighting vehicles and armor personnel carriers, and then you include the armored fighting vehicle class with that, like your armored trucks, your MRAPs, things like that. China has well in excess of 60,000 armored vehicles. You know what we got? We got a third of that. We got like 20,000. So China's a monster. They've got a lot more trucks, too, just regular trucks, like military trucks. They have hundreds of thousands of military trucks. So they can, some of them they can mount weapons on, others would just carry troops, that they could even up armor in a time of war. Like we used to have the deuce and a halves, the 2.5-ton trucks. Now, in the beginning of Iraq, we were still using those. Like we were using those to shuttle around troops, and they started to do local upgrades on them when we were occupying Iraq. They would put armor plating on them and things like that, upgrade them. China could do the same thing with their monstrous truck fleet. They have massive amounts of trucks. Now, their combat aircraft, they've got a grand total of 2,852 combat aircraft. Now, and that's I technically included the J-15, and I shouldn't have, because the J-15 is a naval aircraft. So if you really want to get technical, it's 2,752 aircraft. I'm sorry, 2,702 aircraft. 2,702 aircraft. So 2,702 combat aircraft for their Air Force. And if you combine their naval aviation to that, you get a humongous combat air fleet. But if we're just talking about their regular Air Force, you have the J-82Bs, which are like a Chinese copy of a MiG-21 that has been upgraded to like the 10th power, basically putting it in a 4th generation category as a fighter jet interceptor. They have 410 of those, and those are for their air reserves. Most of those, and they have others as recon, like air recon. But then they have the J-10, which is an extremely modern fighter jet. They have 600 of those. They have 500 J-11s, another extremely modern, up to date combat aircraft. The J-11, J-10, J-11. They got the J-16. Now, out of the J-16, they also have like a subset, which is the J-16D, which, like I was talking about earlier, is an electronic warfare strike aircraft made to go after, air defense, ships, whatever, anything with a radar. They've got 172 plus of those. Now, they have the JF-17, which is mostly for export, but they did keep 170 of those. They also have their newest 5th generation aircraft, the Ch1na, which they have in excess of 200 of by now, because the last known count was 200. They have in excess of that because the numbers officially are 200 plus. So they also, for their strike aircraft, they have 400 JH-7s. Now, keep in mind, 2,400 were produced, and I cannot account for the other 2,000. I don't know what happened to the other 2,000. I don't know if they got sold, if they got put into long-term storage, or if they're reserve storage. I have no idea. But they also have Nanchang Q5s. Now, they have 600 of those. So most of those are also for their air reserve fleet. So they produced 1,300 of the Nanchang Q5s, but I can't, I mean, all I can say about the 700 that they don't have anymore, I could say that most of those were sold, but I can't account for the rest. I know that they sold a lot of those, like Bangladesh got some, and you have what is it, Burma got some, different countries, bought the Q5s. Now, you also have the H-6K strategic bombers, which they've got 242 of. They've got the H-20 stealth bomber, which they have an unknown amount of. I'm sure it's in the several dozens by now that were produced. Now, if we go by naval aviation, they've got the J-15. They even bought some Russian Su-27s, and they bought some Russian Su-30 MKKs for their Navy. And they have the J-15, which is their own, naval combat aircraft, and they also have the J-31, which the J-31 is their fifth generation stealth combat plane that they've built for their Navy, sort of like how the J-20 is their stealth combat plane of their Air Force. So they've got two fifth generation fighter jets, one for their Navy, one for their Air Force, and then they've got a heavy strategic stealth bomber, which is the H-20 stealth bomber for their Air Force. So China's got a hell of an Air Force. Like they have a hell of an Air Force. Now, yes, it is true that our Air Force is still a little bit bigger than theirs is, but that's only because we have more support aircraft than China has. We have this massive Air Mobility Command, which is your transport aircraft, which we have like a couple thousand of. And then you also have all the trainer aircraft, you got the mid-air refueler aircraft, and you've got, what else do you got? You got the AWACS and, things like that. Like, you've got a whole lot of support aircraft. China has all those things too, but they just don't have the numbers of it just yet that we have. So our Air Force comes out a little bit bigger, but their combat air fleet is where it matters, because their combat air fleet is the biggest combat air fleet in the world, meaning they have the most combat planes. They have more combat planes than anybody else. But when it comes to support aircraft, we still have the edge in support aircraft. But that doesn't really matter, because if you're fighting an air campaign, you want to have more combat planes than your enemy does. So they're a monster. They're a humongous threat. So China's a behemoth. Now, of course, when I've compared the Russian and four biggest Western European NATO contributors, I mean, Russia in its own neighborhood in Europe is a monster too. When you compare Russia to the four biggest European NATO nations that contribute to NATO, Russia just outnumbers everybody in tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, 15,000, specialty vehicles. The artillery alone is enormous. They just have way more artillery than the Western European NATO nations. They have more artillery than we do. If you combined our artillery with the artillery of Germany, Britain, France, and Italy, they still outnumber us in artillery pieces and in ammunition. Do you know that Russia has a billion with a B? They have 1 billion artillery shells, meaning that if they continued firing 50,000 shells a day, if they fired their 20 to 50,000 shells a day, that means that they could do this for 40 years. 40 years. If you do the math, 20,000 to 50,000 shells a day, 365, it comes out to pretty close to a 40-year time period. So they've only used almost 2% of all their artillery. And we, on the other hand, have pissed away the vast majority of ours already on a proxy conflict. And we cannot reproduce these items because we don't have the industry for it. Our industries have shrunk dangerously low levels, dangerously low. Same with the anti-tank systems, the man-portable air defense systems that we've given away. We do not have the ability to replace them all in a timely manner. It would take decades to replace most of these systems. It's just, it's insane. And we're pissing it all away on a proxy conflict. So that means when China does something, China's going to stomp a mud hole in our ass, and it's going to be way too easy. Same with Russia. Russia could do it too. Russia could mop the floor with our armed forces at this point. You know, it's not like it used to be when I was in the Army. See, when I was in the Army, things were way different. You know, I mean, we were a professional fighting force back in the day. Now we're nothing. You know, now it's a joke. You know, it's just a joke. So I appreciate everybody being here, and if anybody has anything else to say, please say it, or I'm pretty much done. I've been going for a good hour, so. All right, everybody. Guess everybody's done. Well, then I'm done. You all have a blessed night. Thank each and every one of you for coming.